The liturgy is the pinnacle of the spiritual life. It is the summit of a Catholic's worship. As such, we will be briefly going through a guide as to how one can properly give preparation and thanksgiving in the context of the liturgy. We will start with a quote from Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI from his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. He says, and I quote, "All worship is now a participation in this Pasch of Christ, in his passing over from divine to human, from death to life, to the unity of God and man. Thus, Christian worship is the practical application and fulfillment of the words that Jesus proclaimed on the first day of Holy Week, Palm Sunday, in the temple in Jerusalem. I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." End quote. Given this beautiful quote, and without having to explain why the liturgy is the summit and the most important aspect of a Christian's life, particularly if you're Catholic or Orthodox, we ought, as Catholics, to prepare properly for the celebration of the liturgy. And here we're principally speaking as lay people, not as priests, obviously. But this preparation begins even prior to we enter the actual church. One ought to, if possible, and it is highly suggested, prepare themselves even on the way to the actual church by surrounding themselves in an environment which is conducive to a subjugation of the passions. And what I mean by that is that our consumption of music on the car ride or bus ride or train ride to the church in preparation for the liturgy, that music we listen to, it ought not to arouse the passions, but instead to lift up the mind to God. And obviously this is in the context of listening to various types of liturgical music, Gregorian chant, Eastern chant, perhaps even some classical music of more of a simple tone, to calm down the senses from the busyness of one's day, especially on a Sunday. What this does is it allows the mind not just to focus on God, but to be at peace, to leave the stresses that have been accompanying it from the past week or day or year. It leaves those to rest when one comes to approach the liturgy. So that's one essential piece of advice that we ought to adopt prior to even going to the actual church itself. Now, once arriving at church, it is again highly suggested that we don't get there just about when the liturgy is about to start, when Mass is about to start, but rather we get there at a decent amount of time, 20 minutes before, 15 minutes before, ideally 30 minutes before liturgy, though for many that may not be that practical. 15 minutes would perhaps be a sweet spot. And at that stage, there are a few tips or a few considerations people ought to have in their preparation for the celebration of the liturgy or their participation in that celebration. Now, I've had many people I know ask me personally, and even just in the context of broader discussion, be a bit confused and not sure how they should go about preparing for Mass or for liturgy. From my personal experience in engaging in the spiritual life and striving for holiness, my suggestion would be this: one of two things. One, silence. Embrace yourself in a very simple and profound silence before God in those 15 minutes prior to the liturgy at the beginning of Mass. This calms down the senses completely and allows you to lift your mind up unto God. Perhaps engage in a bit of mental prayer, lifting your mind up to higher things. If you know what feast day it happens to be at a given time, then contemplate that and be at rest. That would be a very good way, I would suggest, to begin one's preparation for the celebration of the liturgy. At the end of that silence, what I would suggest would be a prayer. There are many prayers in the church, prayers from St. Ambrose, from St. Thomas, etc., which are prayers specifically made and written before Mass. They're not that lengthy. At most, they would take you 2 minutes if you're going exceedingly slow reading them. So 10 minutes of silence, perhaps, in that last 5 minutes, saying one of those before Mass prayers. This allows you to, again, have the passions at rest, be properly subjugated by the intellect, and allows you to contemplate God and prepare to engage and participate in Mass and its holy liturgy. These prayers I will provide in the description, specifically the one of St. Thomas Aquinas, but I'll see if there's any other relevant ones that I use from any of my books, and I'll include any of those if they are not too lengthy, and you can refer to the description to find those. But that is what I would suggest. And the reason I would suggest that, quite simply, is I have found that in engaging with other Catholics, that when they approach their pre-Mass prayers, their preparatory prayers, they tend to get too fixated on getting out all of these books and doing a very big deep dive, maybe too heavy spiritual readings and these types of things, which may distract a bit too much, distract the mind, even if they are objectively good things, from the point of why you're there in church at that particular moment, which is, well, presumably if it's a Sunday, obviously a Sunday obligation, but ultimately the sacrifice of the Holy Liturgy of Holy Mass. So that's essential. It's essential that we aren't distracted by other theological works or other deep prayers that have a different purpose, like certain litanies and so on. That is a personal suggestion, of course. It's a subjective type of thing. It depends on the person and what type of prayers they like to pray. But as a general rule, a good amount of silent prayer prior to Mass, prior to liturgy, allows you to really get in the zone, so to speak. Following that, naturally, we're not going to be going through what one ought to do in Mass. The simple answer to that is one ought to follow the rubrics of whatever liturgy they are participating in, whether it's an Eastern or Western rite. At the conclusion of Mass, this is when I would say you have the opportunity for an amazing amount of fruitful prayer. And this is what I would suggest. I would suggest, personally, developing your own types of prayers in addition to using the prayers of the Church in terms of the prayers her saints have written. St. Thomas Aquinas, again, has prayers post-communion and after Mass, and so do many other saints, and the Church in general, providing those resources for us to use after Mass, after the end of the liturgy, to recollect ourselves and give a proper and due thanksgiving for what we have truly received from the beauty of the sacrament. Or ultimately the sacrament of the priesthood, really, and what that confers to us, the Eucharist, the sacrament of communion. For prayers after Mass, those Thanksgiving prayers, I will provide them in the description again, so that people can refer to them. I'm not going to bombard the description to put all of them, but I will put at least one that might be relevant and not that lengthy for your reference. Once that has been done, I would suggest actually cultivating your own personal prayers to God that you stick to. And this point of sticking to something, making it a habit, cultivating a right disposition, a right orientation towards God, and an approach to the liturgy. We're going to return to that point at the end. But to give an example of what I mean by prayers that you would make up, I will give a quick sample of what I like to pray personally and what I've stuck to for quite a few years now in terms of post-Mass prayers, prayers of thanksgiving. Typically, Mass would end. I would take a few seconds to recollect myself and get into a comfortable prayer position, whether it's just sitting down or kneeling on the pews, on the kneelers, sorry. Now, once that is done, I typically would say 3 Hail Marys, followed by 3 Our Fathers. The Our Fathers would be in reference to a specific intention, one for the Holy Father Pope Francis, or whatever Holy Father it happens to be. It would just naturally change according to that. one for Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, and one for Cardinal George Pell. The last two, Pope Benedict XVI and Cardinal George Pell, I add, are two men both of us on this channel greatly admire, and so I personally decided to put those prayer intentions in my liturgy, or in my participation of the liturgy, so that no matter what else happens in my life, I know that I'm going to, at the very least, go to Mass once on a Sunday. And so I will always be weekly praying for those souls of Cardinal George Pell and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. And obviously, with respect to the Pope, we ought to always be praying for the Pope, especially if we, in any capacity, choose to criticize him or his decisions. It is necessary that we pray. Pray for him in his soul and his state of life. So just to repeat, that would be 3 Hail Marys, then followed by 3 Our Fathers. Just to keep that structure in there, it would then be followed by a Hail Holy Queen, the Memorare prayer, the St. Michael the Archangel prayer, and then my own personal sort of spontaneous prayer, which can change at times, but tends to stick to this formula. It is effectively a looking up to Christ onto the cross, and looking internally within myself, having received him in communion, and saying, "My Lord, my God, you have welcomed me into your home, for I was homeless. I was naked, and you clothed me. Frozen, you gave me your spiritual warmth. Lonely, you accompanied me. Burdened, you lifted my load. Starving, thirsty, on the brink of death, you gave me your body, blood, soul, and divinity to eat and drink, giving unto me eternal life. My Lord, my God, I can never thank you enough for this gift that you have given me, but all I can do is beseech thee to make my heart like unto thine, my love." And then I would meditate for a little bit if I had time. If not, I would end the Thanksgiving prayers with a glory be, and then leave the church. Now, that structure, naturally, I'm not advising everyone to follow that exact structure. That is what I personally use. But what I have found is extremely helpful is sticking to a set structure at all times, no matter what happens or what's after the liturgy or where I have to go. By sticking to that, it makes it particularly efficacious in a similar way to as a husband loving his wife. Over the years, despite the troubles, he always has to love his wife in a certain way, doing certain things, doing certain chores, working and providing for the family. In the same way, by applying that rigorous structure and that habit of those same prayers for Thanksgiving, after Mass, it becomes second nature, so to speak. It orients a disposition of continual thanksgiving and love for Christ. And so I would highly suggest that to those who want to really learn to love Christ and love him through his liturgy, love him and worship him how he wants to ultimately be loved and worshipped, that we make a habit of good preparation before the liturgy and good thanksgiving after it. And to end this brief video, we'll end with another quote from Pope Benedict XVI, again from his book, The Spirit of the Liturgy. A quick quote, he says this: "We throw ourselves down, as Jesus did, before the mystery of God's power present to us, knowing that the cross is the true burning bush, the place of the flame of God's love, which burns but does not destroy." End quote.